Snow had a way of swallowing sound, of making the world feel like a long-held breath. The prairie stretched endless and pale, a land erased by winter's heavy hand, until sky and earth blurred in one merciless shade of white. In the middle of that frozen nowhere, a young woman stumbled forward, her deerskin cloak stiff with frost, her arms burdened not with possessions but with two small daughters clinging to her like roots refusing to tear free from earth. Elena Whitebird's breath left her in ragged clouds, her lips cracked, her eyes raw from wind, yet still she pressed on, for stopping was to admit surrender. The twins were only 4, though their faces already bore the red chafing of windburn and the hollow look of hunger. Maribel whimpered softly against her mother's shoulder while Clara dragged a mitten too big for her tiny hand, clutching her mother's skirt as though it were the last tether keeping her from drifting into the storm. Elena whispered a lullaby in her native tongue, the words trembling into the gale, but the wind stole them, scattering them across the barren plain. She lowered her head, ashamed at the futility of her song, ashamed at the choice that had driven her here, falling in love with a man her people refused to accept, losing him to fever before winter, then losing the tribe itself when their patience with her grief and mixed-blood daughters turned thin as ice. She had thought pride would be enough to carry her. She had thought love, even after death, could shield her from exile. But now, with every step into snow that rose past her knees, pride was a burden heavier than any child. Shame pressed on her chest until she could hardly breathe. Perhaps the snow was a kinder grave than their judging eyes, she thought. Perhaps it was easier to sink into white silence. A sound broke through, distant at first, then closer. The crunch of hooves, muffled yet deliberate. Elena froze, heart hammering. The twins stirred, sensing her fear, clinging tighter. Through the curtain of falling snow, a shadow emerged, dark against pale, a rider drawing nearer with the slow certainty of someone who had no need to rush. The horse's breath fumed like smoke, its coat dusted white with frost, its rider hunched against the cold. He came into view, a man no older than 30, though his beard and the weight of his eyes gave him the presence of someone twice worn by years. His coat was patched, his hat tugged low, his frame lean as though pared down by hunger and solitude. His eyes, gray, steady, searching, found her first, then drifted to the children huddled at her skirts. He did not speak. The storm howled between them like a barrier neither knew how to cross. Elena's throat ached, words clawing their way out against fear. "Please," she whispered, though the wind nearly drowned her. She clutched the girls closer, falling to her knees in snow that stung like knives. Her voice broke open, raw and pleading. "Please, don't leave me here with my kids." The man sat still, his gloved hands gripping the reins. Silence stretched, heavier than judgment. He looked at her as though weighing something she could not name, her worth, perhaps, or his own courage. His horse stamped, restless. He shifted finally, dismounting with slow deliberation. Snow swallowed the sound of his boots as he stepped closer. Elena flinched when his shadow fell across her. He did not offer words, only lowered himself to one knee beside her daughters. His face softened, though he hid it quickly as though emotion were a shameful weakness. The smallest girl, Maribel, blinked up at him with half-frozen lashes. Without speaking, he lifted her carefully, settling her against his chest. The child sagged into the warmth of his coat, her tiny hand clutching his collar. Elena's breath caught. A stranger carrying her child? Was this salvation or ruin? Her heart stumbled between gratitude and terror. The man straightened, shifting the girl gently onto the horse's saddle. Still he said nothing. Elena searched his face, desperate for something. A word, a promise, even a name, but found only the guarded stillness of someone who had built his walls high. She rose on shaking legs, carrying Clara, and followed as he gestured wordlessly toward the shadowed line of pine ridge barely visible through the storm. His silence was not cruelty now, it was something else, something harder to name. They moved together, step by grinding step through the snow. Elena's strength faltered more than once, her knees threatening to buckle, yet each time the man's hand closed firmly around her arm, lifting her with quiet insistence. Not tender, not gentle, but purposeful, like a man accustomed to pulling others from the edge whether he wished to or not. By the time the cabin came into view, a squat shape pressed against the shelter of trees, Elena's legs trembled near collapse. Smoke trailed weakly from the chimney. The man opened the door, ushered her inside, and for the first time since dawn, warmth wrapped around her. The air smelled of pine and old leather, smoke and faint bitterness of coffee grounds long used and reused. The room was sparse, a narrow bed, a rough table, a hearth where embers glowed. No ornaments, no softness. A place of survival, not of comfort. He set Maribel carefully on the bed, then moved wordlessly to the hearth, coaxing the fire higher. Elena huddled on the floor with Clara, whispering thanks, though the words felt too small for what had just passed. He did not respond. His silence filled the room like another presence, heavy but not unkind. The girls ate when he placed bread before them, crumbs falling into their laps as they devoured each bite. Elena forced herself to take the smallest portion, ashamed of her hunger, yet he left his plate untouched as though her need outweighed his. She watched him from the corner of her eye, studied the way his shoulders bore invisible weight, how his gaze lingered on the children when he thought she did not notice. Days folded into one another beneath the snow's endless siege. The storm did not relent, trapping them together in a cabin meant for one. Jonas Hartwell, that was the name she finally coaxed from him after 2 days of silence, moved with the habit of solitude, his gestures deliberate, economical, as though every movement carried history. He repaired the children's boots, taught them how to pack snow for melting, left food by Elena's side without ceremony. She, in turn, stitched the tears in his coat, cleaned the hearth, tried to make herself less burden. Their exchanges were never clothed in words, but in gestures so small they might have gone unnoticed had they not carried such weight. At night, when the girls slept tangled in blankets by the fire, Elena would wake sometimes to find Jonas standing at the window, his back rigid, his gaze lost in the white silence outside. Once she heard him whisper a name, not hers, not his own, but another woman's. She did not ask. She knew grief when she saw it, and grief was a language without need of translation. Food ran low as winter deepened. One morning Jonas strapped on his rifle, preparing to hunt. His hands shook as he checked the strap. Fear, Elena realized, not for himself but for those he would leave behind. She touched his sleeve, her voice unsteady but resolute. "If you don't come back, we'll manage." The words were brittle, yet they carried dignity. For the first time his eyes met hers without defense. Respect flickered there, brief but undeniable. He returned at dusk, staggering beneath the weight of a deer across his shoulders. Blood speckled the snow behind him. Elena rushed from the cabin, the cold biting her face, and caught his arm before he could fall. In that moment, beneath a sky clearing to reveal stars scattered like shards of ice, something shifted. Their breaths mingled in the frozen air, his exhaustion pressed against her strength, her gratitude against his silence. Behind them, the children's voices called from the doorway, high and bright against the vast stillness. Jonas steadied himself, his voice low, rough with disuse. "You're not alone anymore." Elena's eyes filled, tears spilling hot against frozen skin. She bent her head, the snow swallowing her sobs, and for the first time since exile, the world did not feel like a grave. It felt like a beginning. The snow at last began to loosen its grip. Now and then sunlight broke through the bruised sky, laying pale streaks across the land as though heaven itself had cracked a door. Days grew a little longer, the cold a little softer, though hunger and weariness still lingered in every breath within the cabin. Jonas spent days bedridden after his return with the deer. His shoulders bore cuts, his body the exhaustion of long solitude. Elena kept the fire alive, split kindling with aching arms, carried melted snow for water, and tended to him once the children had fallen asleep. Her hands trembled as she bound his wounds, yet her eyes no longer trembled with fear but with determination. Jonas sometimes closed his eyes, yet in the hard lines of his face she caught fleeting moments of peace, as though someone had finally chosen to trust him again. The twins, Maribel and Clara, stopped calling him Mr. Jonas. Soon it was simply Jonas, their laughter circling the small cabin like birdsong. They chased around his boots, tried on his battered hat, giggled at the jingling of his spurs. The man who had once lived behind iron walls found himself quietly disarmed. He tried to hide the curve of his lips, but Elena saw it, the ice around his spirit cracking almost against his will. One morning sunlight spilled across the threshold, and Elena noticed small flowers pushing through the retreating snow. Yellow flickers against white. She raised her hands upward, whispering, "We survived." Jonas, standing apart, watched her in silence. He said nothing, but in his eyes flickered something like agreement, something like gratitude. Spring seeped into the soil and into their lives. Together they tilled the earth, sowed seeds, showed the children how to press kernels gently beneath the soil with small prayers. Jonas spoke little, but when he did his words carried weight. Elena no longer mistook his silence for distance. It was simply the language of a heart that had once broken. One evening, with the fire crackling outside and the children already asleep, Elena asked softly, "What will people say if I stay here?" Jonas tipped his hat toward the flames, pausing before answering. People will always say something. The only question is, what does your heart say? Elena held his gaze in the firelight. No strangeness remained there, only a quiet, waiting hope. She whispered, "My heart says this is home." Still, the outside world did not forget them. When they traveled to town for supplies, stares followed. Whispers cut sharp. A native woman, a drifter with two girls clinging to his side. But Jonas never flinched. He stood tall, boots planted, his silence a shield stronger than words. Elena understood then. He did not fight back with anger. He fought back with presence, with an unshaken dignity that taught the children not to bow their heads. By the river one afternoon as the children played, Jonas spoke at last. His voice was low, careful, as though placing stones across a rushing stream. "Elena, you can stay here forever if you wish, but we could also begin again together." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a vow. Elena felt a warmth rise inside her, as if loneliness itself had been lifted from her shoulders. "A new beginning," she answered softly. "But not alone this time." Weeks later, in the open meadow near the cabin, under a sky clear and endless, they wed. The children ran through grass damp with morning dew, their laughter ringing out as wildflowers bent in their small fists. Jonas wore his cleanest coat, patched but straight, his shoulders squared with quiet pride. Elena had sewn her own dress, plain yet radiant in the sunlight. Maribel and Clara tucked blossoms into her dark hair, their hands careful, reverent. A preacher came from the nearby settlement. No crowd stood witness, only the vast prairie, the earth beneath, and the heavens above. Yet it felt enough. More than enough. Jonas listened to the preacher's words, his jaw tight, his heart thundering in his chest. At last he spoke, voice breaking just slightly, "I promise you will never be alone again." Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks. She clasped the children's hands as though weaving them into the vow. "This is our home. We are not 3 anymore. We are 4. The preacher closed with prayer. The girls clapped their small hands together, cheering. Jonas and Elena turned to one another, eyes meeting, silence saying what words could not. From that day the cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. Each night 4 voices gathered around the fire, 4 lives weaving together, steady and strong. Townsfolk could whisper, the world could doubt, but they knew the truth carved by survival and softened by grace. A family had taken root where once there was only snow and silence. And though the story of their days stretched long beyond that moment, the vow stood firm, shining like the stars above the prairie. They had found not just shelter but belonging, not just survival but love.